It was just another ordinary flight for Mia Simmons, or so everyone thought. She was simply a mother, traveling with her young son, Jason, to visit family they hadn't seen in years. Mia had been looking forward to this trip for so long. It had been a tough few months for her, and the reunion was exactly what she needed to recharge. The idea of spending time with her parents and siblings again brought a smile to her face. The only thing standing between them and a long-awaited vacation was the flight. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like these types of stories, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. But what the passengers on this flight didn't know was that there was something about Mia that no one could see right away. It wasn't obvious to anyone when she first walked onto the plane. There was no sign on her that screamed, "I'm special." To the casual observer, Mia was just a regular mother. She had a warm smile, short curly hair, and a gentle voice. Jason, her son, was holding her hand, his small backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked up at her with wide eyes, full of excitement for the adventure ahead. But under the calm surface, Mia carried something powerful, a strength that was hidden from view. It was a quiet strength, the kind that only showed itself when it was truly needed. As Mia and Jason walked down the aisle, she noticed a few people glancing at them. Some looked curious, others didn't pay much attention at all. But Mia was used to being overlooked. It happened often. She had learned how to move through the world without drawing too much attention to herself. And in that moment, she didn't expect anything to be different. She was just a mother traveling with her son. Mia found her seat by the window. She smiled at Jason, who was already getting comfortable, adjusting his seatbelt. She felt a sense of calm in this moment, but little did she know that everything was about to change. As Mia settled into her seat and buckled up, a flight attendant, a woman named Karen, came over to help another passenger with their bag. She was walking down the aisle when she suddenly stopped right in front of Mia's seat. Mia looked up at her, waiting for the woman to continue on her way. But Karen didn't move. "Excuse me," Karen said, looking at Mia with a stern expression. "This seat is reserved." Mia blinked, confused. She had been assigned this seat when she booked the ticket, and there was nothing on her boarding pass that indicated it was reserved for anyone else. "Reserved?" Mia asked, raising an eyebrow. "But I'm sitting here already." Karen crossed her arms and shook her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this seat is not available for you." Mia's heart started to race. She couldn't understand why this was happening. The seat was hers. There was no mistake. It was clearly marked on her boarding pass. But Karen didn't seem to care. She stood there, waiting for Mia to get up. Mia took a deep breath. She didn't want to cause trouble, but this was wrong. She looked down at Jason, who was already a little nervous about what was happening. "Can you please check again?" Mia asked softly. She didn't want to argue, but something about the way Karen was acting made her feel uneasy. Karen's face remained unchanged. "I'm sorry, Mom. You need to move to another seat." Mia was frustrated, but she didn't raise her voice. She had learned to stay calm in situations like this, to hold her ground when needed. But she wasn't going to give up so easily. "Can you check with someone else?" she asked, trying to stay polite. Karen hesitated for a moment before walking off to speak with another flight attendant. Mia sat there, wondering if this was just some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Karen was having a bad day, or maybe it was just a mistake. But as the minutes ticked by, Mia began to notice something strange. Karen wasn't talking to the other attendants. Instead, she was talking quietly to someone in the front of the plane, someone who looked like a manager. Mia couldn't hear their conversation, but the way they were looking at her made her feel uncomfortable. "Mom, what's going on?" Jason asked, his little voice full of confusion. Mia smiled at him, trying to keep him calm. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll figure this out. Just stay here with me, okay?" Jason nodded, but Mia could see the worry in his eyes. She wanted to protect him from this. She didn't want him to see her upset, but she couldn't help it. There was a knot forming in her stomach. Finally, after what felt like forever, Karen returned. She looked even more annoyed than before, and Mia could feel the tension in the air. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Karen said, her tone much colder now. "But you need to move. This seat is reserved for someone else." Mia felt a wave of anger rising in her chest. She had tried to be patient, But now it was clear that something wasn't right. This wasn't just a mistake or misunderstanding. Karen was treating her differently for some reason. But why? What did she do to deserve this? Mia stood up slowly, trying to remain calm. "If my seat is truly taken, I'll gladly move," she said, "but I would like to know why I'm being asked to move. Could you please explain?" Karen's eyes flickered for a second, and Mia noticed how she avoided eye contact. It was clear Karen didn't want to explain, but before she could say anything, Mia saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The passenger who was supposed to be sitting in the seat Mia had reserved. He had arrived, and Mia couldn't believe her eyes. The man was not even looking at her. He walked past her with barely a glance, heading straight to his seat. But it was the way he walked that caught Mia's attention. There was something about him that didn't sit right with her. As the man settled into the seat, Mia could see Karen standing by, watching them. The flight attendant smiled at the man in a way that felt wrong. Why was Karen treating this man with such obvious kindness? Why was she treating Mia like an outsider? Before Mia could make sense of it all, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "We'll be taking off shortly. Please make sure you're all seated and ready for departure." Mia looked down at Jason, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in her chest. She didn't want to cause a scene, especially not in front of her son. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. What was going on? Why was Karen treating her like this? Before Mia could even process what was happening, Karen returned to her post, but the way she glanced back at Mia told her everything. This wasn't just a simple mistake. Mia had been targeted, and she was about to find out why. Mia had been traveling for hours, and by the time she reached her gate, her body felt tired. She hadn't slept much the night before, and the excitement of finally getting to see her family had kept her awake longer than usual. Jason, her son, had been bouncing with energy as they waited at the gate, but Mia could feel herself starting to drag. She had packed their bags carefully, made sure Jason had everything he needed, and double-checked that they had their boarding passes ready. Everything seemed to be going smoothly so far, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She had traveled a lot over the years, and there was always that tiny voice in her head warning her that something could go wrong, no matter how prepared she was. When their flight finally started boarding, Mia felt a sense of relief. They could finally sit down, relax, and start the long journey toward their family. It would be the first time Mia and Jason had seen her parents in over a year, and the thought of being with them again kept her going. As Mia walked through the tunnel toward the airplane, she glanced around. The other passengers didn't seem too different from the ones she had seen on other flights. A few people were chatting with each other, while others had their faces buried in their phones. Jason was walking beside her, his small hand holding tightly onto hers. He was so excited, and it made Mia smile to see him so happy. Finally, they reached the door of the airplane. Mia stepped up onto the small stairs and into the airplane, where the flight attendants greeted them with a polite smile. Mia could tell that this was a busy flight, but that didn't bother her. She was used to traveling with Jason, and she knew how to handle it. She looked at her boarding pass again to make sure she was heading to the right seat. It was a window seat, which was exactly what she needed. She liked to sit by the window during flights. It gave her a chance to relax, look outside, and think. It was also a little quieter by the window, and she knew Jason would fall asleep more easily if he had a window seat to look out of. The seat was near the middle of the plane, so Mia carefully made her way down the narrow aisle, with Jason following behind her. They passed several rows of seats, and Mia could see other passengers already settling in. Some were reading, others were chatting, and a few were already buckling their seatbelts. Mia was getting closer to her seat when she saw it, a row with an empty window seat. It looked perfect. She could already imagine herself sitting there with Jason, both of them comfortable and ready for the long flight ahead. The only problem was that when she got closer to the seat, a flight attendant, a woman named Karen, stepped right into her path. Mia stopped walking, not sure why Karen was blocking the aisle. The flight attendant didn't smile or offer any kind of greeting. Instead, she simply looked at Mia and said in a sharp, cold voice, "Sorry, ma'am. This seat is reserved." Mia blinked, confused. Reserved? She looked at the seat again. There were no signs, no labels indicating it was taken. The seat was empty, and it was the one that was assigned to her on her boarding pass. Her stomach sank a little as she tried to understand what was happening. Reserved? Mia repeated, still trying to process it. But this is my seat. It's on my boarding pass. Karen didn't respond to that. She just stood there, blocking the aisle, and repeated herself in a firm tone. Sorry, ma'am. This seat is reserved. Mia was tired, frustrated, and now a little bit confused. She had been traveling for hours, and all she wanted was to sit down and relax. But it seemed like Karen was making this harder than it needed to be. Could you please check again? Mia asked, trying to keep her voice calm. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't understand why she was being told to move. I've been assigned this seat. Maybe there's been a mistake. Karen didn't even look at the boarding pass in Mia's hand. Instead, she just shook her head. This seat is reserved for another passenger. Please step aside, ma'am. She didn't say it with any explanation or kindness, just coldly. Mia felt a little heat rise in her cheeks. She had asked nicely. She had explained that this was her seat. But Karen wasn't even listening. Ma'am, Karen said again, her voice even sharper now. I need you to step aside. Mia paused for a second, her heart beating a little faster. What was happening? She didn't want to make a scene, especially not in front of Jason, but something about this felt wrong. She looked at Karen again. The woman's eyes were cold, and she didn't seem interested in hearing what Mia had to say. It was as though Karen had already made up her mind, and Mia's presence wasn't going to change that. Ma'am, could you please step aside? Karen repeated again, her tone not leaving any room for discussion. Mia could see that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Mia tried to stay calm, her hand still holding on to Jason's, who was looking up at her, confused. He didn't understand why the flight attendant was being so rude. Mia didn't want him to worry, but she could tell that Jason was starting to feel the tension too. Can you just check again? Mia asked a little more forcefully this time. I have my boarding pass right here, and this is my seat. I don't understand why you're saying it's reserved. Karen's eyes narrowed for a second, and then she looked at Mia's boarding pass. It was as if Mia had just asked her to do something impossible. She didn't seem interested in helping, just in getting Mia to move out of the way. I'm sorry, but this seat is taken, Karen said again, her voice now more dismissive than before. She didn't make eye contact, and she didn't offer an apology for the mix-up. Mia took a deep breath, trying to remain calm for Jason's sake. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Mia said softly, but I've been assigned this seat, and I really need to sit down. Karen didn't respond. She didn't apologize or try to solve the problem. Instead, she just stood there, blocking the aisle, expecting Mia to move out of her way. Mia felt her frustration growing, but she tried not to let it show. She knew she needed to handle this calmly, especially in front of Jason. But as Mia stood there, trying to understand why this was happening, she couldn't help but feel that Karen wasn't treating her fairly. Why was she being singled out like this? Was this really just a mistake? Or was something else going on? Mia was no stranger to being treated unfairly. It had happened before, and she had learned to stand her ground. But this was different. This felt personal, and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was acting as if Mia didn't belong in that seat. As Mia stood there, waiting for Karen to make her next move, she could feel her pulse quicken. She didn't want to make a scene, but at the same time, she wasn't about to back down. She looked at Jason, who was watching the whole situation unfold, and she knew she had to stay strong. He was depending on her to keep things together. Ma'am, Karen said again, her tone impatient now. Please step aside. I need you to move. Mia's stomach twisted with frustration. She couldn't understand why this was happening, but she wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Karen, please, Mia said, her voice steady but firm. I just want to sit down. This is my seat. Mia tried her best to stay calm, but as the minutes passed, it was getting harder. The feeling that something wasn't quite right grew stronger. She could feel the eyes of the passengers behind her on her back. Some whispered to each other, and others just stared. Mia tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. Her heart was beating faster now. What was going on? Why was she being treated this way? She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just trying to get to her seat, sit down, and get comfortable for the flight. But Karen, the flight attendant, wasn't making that easy. Mia glanced over at her son, Jason, who was holding onto her hand tightly. He didn't really understand why they were standing there, but he could tell something was wrong. His little face looked confused, and it made Mia's heart ache. She didn't want him to worry. She wanted to get him to their seats so they could relax, but now she felt like she was in the middle of some kind of strange game. Mia knew she had to do something. She couldn't just let Karen stand there and block her way. She had to try something else. So, with as much patience as she could muster, she walked calmly toward the crew desk. It wasn't far from where she was standing, so she didn't have to walk long before she reached the flight attendants who were still busy checking passengers. Mia tried to keep her voice steady as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said politely to one of the crew members who was standing behind the desk. The crew member turned and looked at Mia. She smiled at first, but Mia could tell that the smile was a little nervous, like she wasn't sure what to say. "I have a problem with my seat. I've been assigned to seat 12A, but the flight attendant, Karen, says it's reserved. Can you help me?" Mia asked, trying to stay calm. She didn't want to cause a scene, but she needed answers. The crew member looked at Mia's boarding pass and quickly apologized. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. There must be some mistake. Your seat is not reserved. Let me check again and make sure everything is okay." Mia nodded and waited. She could feel her fingers gripping Jason's hand a little tighter, but she didn't want to show how upset she was. Jason looked up at her, still not understanding what was happening. "Mom, why can't we sit down?" he asked in his soft little voice. Mia crouched down to his level and smiled, even though her heart was racing. "I'm not sure, buddy, but we'll be sitting down in a minute. Don't worry." She didn't want him to feel afraid or anxious, so she kept her words calm. The flight attendant who had been helping Mia went over to another crew member, talking quietly for a moment. Mia tried not to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help but notice the way the two flight attendants kept looking at her and Karen. It was as if they were trying to figure out what had happened. Finally, the flight attendant returned to Mia. "We apologize for the confusion," she said again, though Mia could tell she was just reading from a script. It was clear the woman was uncomfortable with the whole situation. "There's nothing wrong with your seat, ma'am. You can go ahead and take your seat now." Mia wanted to believe the flight attendant. She wanted to believe that this was all just a simple mistake. But something in the way Karen was acting told her there was more going on. Why hadn't Karen just apologized right away and let Mia sit down? Why had she been so rude and dismissive? Mia glanced over at Karen, who was standing off to the side now, looking much more flustered than she had earlier. Her face had turned red, and she was fumbling with her notes, as if trying to hide something. Mia knew that feeling well. It was the feeling you get when you're caught doing something wrong, but you don't want anyone to know. Mia took a deep breath. It was hard to stay calm, but she had to keep her cool for Jason. She was still trying to figure out what was really going on here. Was it just a mistake, or was there something more to it? Mia didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was up to something. Jason tugged at her hand. "Mom, can we sit down now?" he asked again, his voice a little quieter this time. Mia nodded and smiled at him. "Yes, sweetie, we can sit down now," she said, trying to make the situation feel normal again. She walked back toward the row where her seat was, with Jason following close behind. As they reached the row, Mia couldn't help but notice the strange look on Karen's face. She was still standing by the front of the plane, staring at Mia, but now she had a strange look in her eyes. It was a mix of nervousness and something else, something that Mia couldn't quite put her finger on. "Everything okay now, ma'am?" Karen asked, but there was something off in her voice. It wasn't a warm question, like the crew members earlier. It sounded almost forced. Mia nodded, trying not to show how suspicious she was feeling. "Yes, thank you," she said politely. "I just needed to sit down." She didn't want to make a scene, but she was starting to feel more and more uncomfortable. She slid into the window seat, helping Jason get settled next to her. The seatbelt sign was still on, but the plane was slowly beginning to fill up with passengers, and Mia knew they were almost ready to take off. But as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whispers from the other passengers were still there. She could hear them clearly now, and it made her feel uneasy. It was as if people were talking about her behind her back, and Mia didn't like it. She had never been one to seek attention, but now it felt like everyone was watching her. She glanced around at the other passengers. Some of them looked away when they saw her looking at them, while others just kept staring, their eyes lingering a little too long. Mia couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking. And then, as she looked toward the front of the plane, she saw Karen again. The flight attendant was talking to a few of the other crew members, but Karen kept looking in Mia's direction. Her eyes were narrowed, and Mia could tell she was talking about her. Mia's heart skipped a beat. Why was Karen so focused on her? What was going on? Mia didn't want to jump to conclusions, But the more she watched, the more she realized that Karen was acting strangely. Karen's behavior didn't make sense. Why hadn't she apologized right away? Why had she been so rude to Mia? And why did it feel like Karen was trying to hide something? Mia leaned back in her seat, trying to relax, but the questions were racing through her mind. She couldn't just ignore what had happened. There had to be an explanation, and Mia was determined to find it. She just needed to be patient. But deep down, she knew something bigger was going on. This wasn't just a simple mix-up. There was something personal here, and Mia was going to find out what it was. As Mia sat in her seat, trying to get comfortable, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange interaction with Karen. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like something was off. She looked down at Jason, who had finally settled in and was playing with his toy. Mia smiled at him, trying to keep herself calm for his sake. But in the back of her mind, she kept replaying the moment when Karen had stopped her from sitting down. Why had the flight attendant acted so rudely? And why was she acting so flustered now? Mia had never experienced anything like this before, especially not when traveling with her son. It was supposed to be a simple flight, just the two of them heading to a family reunion. But now it felt like she was caught in the middle of some weird drama that she didn't understand. She let out a deep sigh, trying to shake off the bad feeling that was starting to settle in her chest. But as the plane's engines roared to life, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where Karen was still standing, talking to another flight attendant. This time, Karen seemed to be looking right at Mia. The way she was staring made Mia feel uncomfortable. It wasn't a casual look. It was sharp and focused, like she was trying to figure something out. Mia couldn't stand it any longer. She had to find out what was going on, but she didn't want to make a scene, especially with Jason sitting beside her. She didn't want to upset him, but she couldn't ignore the fact that something strange was happening. Karen's strange behavior, the way people were whispering, and the way she kept looking at Mia, it all felt wrong. Just then, the seatbelt sign flickered off, and the fasten seatbelt sign went dark. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker, announcing that they had reached cruising altitude. We'll be starting beverage service soon, so feel free to sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight, the captain said. But Mia wasn't relaxed. Not at all. She tried to focus on Jason, who was happily playing with his toy, but her mind kept racing. What was going on with Karen? Why had she acted the way she did? Why did it feel like she was being singled out? Mia decided to take action. She couldn't just sit there and let this go on without understanding why it was happening. She turned to Jason, trying to keep her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, I need to go speak to the flight attendants for a minute. Stay here, and I'll be right back, okay?" Jason nodded without looking up from his toy. Mia kissed his forehead quickly before standing up. She made her way back down the aisle toward the crew area. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed to be staring at her. Some passengers quickly turned their heads when she looked in their direction, while others continued to whisper to each other. It felt like she was the center of attention, but not in a good way. Mia reached the crew area, where Karen was standing with a couple of other flight attendants. When Karen saw Mia approach, her smile was forced, almost like she was trying to hide something. "Is everything okay now, ma'am?" Karen asked, her voice still sounding a little too sweet, almost like she was trying too hard. Mia wasn't sure how to respond. She wanted to stay calm, but she also needed to understand what was going on. "I just don't understand," Mia began, her voice steady but firm. "Why did you stop me from sitting down earlier? My seat was clearly available, and you didn't give me a good reason why I couldn't sit there. It was very confusing, and I felt uncomfortable." Karen shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with Mia's directness. "I'm sorry for any confusion," she said quickly, glancing at the other flight attendants for support. "There was just some confusion with the seating arrangement. It's really nothing personal." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Confusion? But there was no sign on the seat, and you didn't even give me a chance to ask. You just stopped me without an explanation." Karen hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile again. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. I just made a mistake, that's all." But Mia wasn't convinced. Something wasn't adding up, and she could tell that Karen was trying to brush it off too quickly. Mia knew there was more to this story, and she wasn't going to let it go until she got answers. She took a deep breath and pressed on. "I understand that mistakes happen, but when you treat me like that, I start to wonder if there's something else going on. Is there something personal here? Did I do something to upset you?" Karen's face went pale at the suggestion, and she quickly looked away. The other flight attendants standing beside her exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none of them spoke up. Mia could tell that they were trying to stay out of it. Mia knew she had to be careful. She didn't want to cause a bigger scene, but she also didn't want to let Karen get away with whatever she was doing. She wasn't going to let herself be treated this way, especially not in front of her son. The air was thick with tension. Mia stood her ground, her eyes locked on Karen's face, waiting for her to speak. I don't know what you're talking about, Karen stammered, her voice shaking. There's no personal issue here. I just made a mistake, okay. But Mia wasn't sure she believed Karen anymore. Something about the way Karen was acting made it clear that there was more to the story than she was letting on. Before Mia could say anything else, another flight attendant came over. This one was taller and looked much more confident. She smiled at Mia and extended her hand. Sandra. I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. Is everything okay here? Sandra asked, her voice calm and professional. Mia turned to face Sandra, grateful for the change in tone. I hope so, Mia replied. But I'm not sure. I was just trying to sit down, and Karen stopped me, saying my seat was reserved. But there was no sign on it, and when I asked, she didn't give me a good explanation. I just want to understand what's going on. Sandra nodded, her expression serious but not unfriendly. I'm really sorry about that, ma'am. Let me check the seating chart again and see what happened. I'm sure it was just a mistake. Mia didn't trust the word mistake anymore, but she stayed quiet, waiting for Sandra to check. Sandra quickly flipped through her seating chart, scanning it for a few moments. Mia's heart beat faster as she waited. Finally, Sandra turned to face her again. I'm sorry for the confusion, Sandra said. I don't see any reason why your seat should have been unavailable. I'll make sure to follow up with Karen, and we'll get this sorted out. Mia felt a small sense of relief. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. Thank you, Mia said, though she still felt unsettled. But I don't understand why I was treated this way. It felt wrong. Sandra nodded, her eyes full of sympathy. I understand. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Again, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Mia forced a smile, feeling like she had finally gotten some clarity. But deep down, she knew the situation wasn't over. She still didn't know the real reason why Karen had acted so strangely, and she wasn't going to let it go until she got the full story. Just as Mia was about to give up and move to a different seat, a sudden announcement over the intercom shocked the passengers. Attention passengers, we have just been informed that there has been a mix-up regarding seating. We apologize for the inconvenience, and we ask that everyone remain seated while we resolve the issue. Mia's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had been feeling uneasy for the past hour, and now it seemed like the truth was finally coming out. Mia's pulse quickened, and she held her breath, wondering what would happen next. A few moments later, Mia heard the soft footsteps of someone approaching. But it wasn't just anyone. This was no ordinary crew member. The figure that appeared at the front of the aisle was a senior staff member, walking with confidence and purpose. Mia could tell from her uniform that she was the chief flight attendant. And she wasn't alone. As the chief flight attendant walked down the aisle, Karen's face turned even paler than before. Mia couldn't help but notice how Karen's hands shook slightly as she glanced up at the chief flight attendant, her eyes wide with fear. The senior flight attendant stopped right in front of Karen, and they exchanged a few quick words. Mia couldn't hear what was being said, but the tension in the air was palpable. Mia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve on edge. The whole plane seemed to hold its breath. Passengers stopped talking, their attention now fully on what was unfolding in front of them. Even Jason, who had been distracted by his toy, looked up at Mia with a confused expression. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the senior flight attendant stepped forward and cleared her throat, speaking into the intercom. The entire cabin went completely silent. Mia's stomach twisted as she listened intently. Ladies and gentlemen, the senior flight attendant began, her voice calm and steady. It turns out that the seat Mia Simmons is entitled to has been wrongfully assigned to another passenger. We sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding and will now resolve it immediately. Mia felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. This was the moment that the truth was coming to light. She had been right all along. There was something wrong about how Karen had treated her. The murmurs started almost immediately. Passengers exchanged confused glances, whispering to each other. Mia could hear the buzz of conversations growing louder as people tried to process what they had just heard. Wrongfully assigned? Mia heard one passenger ask in disbelief. Was it really a mix-up? Another whispered. Mia's head was spinning. She had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Karen had been caught in a lie. She had no way to hide anymore. But Mia wasn't prepared for what came next. As the murmurs continued to spread, Mia noticed Karen's face. Her expression went from pale to completely white, and her eyes darted nervously from the senior flight attendant to Mia. Karen took a shaky step backward, her hands trembling slightly. The guilt was written all over her face. She had been exposed, and Mia could see it in her eyes. The truth was finally coming out. Mia's stomach dropped as she processed the weight of what was happening. For a moment, everything felt still, as if the entire world had frozen. The truth was more complicated than Mia had ever imagined, and now it was all being revealed. Then, the senior flight attendant addressed the entire cabin once more, her tone firm and authoritative. We have discovered that this was no simple mistake. It turns out that Karen, our flight attendant, made a deliberate decision to deny this seat to Ms. Simmons for personal reasons. She has been investigated and found to have targeted Ms. Simmons in a way that goes against our company's policies and values. Mia could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had been targeted? By Karen? Her head was spinning as she tried to make sense of it all. Why would Karen do something like this? But before Mia could process everything, the senior flight attendant continued. As part of an ongoing investigation, Karen's actions have now been revealed. She intentionally withheld the seat from Ms. Simmons and misled both her and the rest of the passengers. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Passengers were in shock. No one had expected this. Mia had no idea what kind of investigation the senior flight attendant was talking about, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. As the senior flight attendant's words sank in, Mia couldn't help but glance over at Karen. The once confident flight attendant was now standing with her shoulders slumped, her head down in shame. The once shiny uniform she wore seemed to weigh heavily on her now, as though the truth was crushing her under its weight. Mia's mind was racing. She wanted answers. She needed to understand why Karen had targeted her. What had Mia done to deserve this? She had only wanted to sit down in a seat on a plane with her son. But instead, she had been met with an aggressive, strange interaction that now seemed to be rooted in something far deeper. Before Mia could say anything, the senior flight attendant spoke again. We will be reporting this incident to the proper authorities. Karen will no longer be continuing on this flight. We will ensure that she is escorted off the plane once we land. Mia couldn't believe her ears. Karen would be kicked off the plane? For what? For treating Mia like she didn't matter? For denying her something as simple as a seat? The shock of it all left Mia speechless. The senior flight attendant turned toward Mia, her face softening. Ms. Simmons, I want to personally apologize to you for what you've been put through. You didn't deserve this. You've been wronged, and we will make sure that this situation is handled properly. Mia nodded, still processing everything that had just happened. She didn't know what to say. She had never been in a situation like this before. It wasn't every day that someone was kicked off a plane because of a personal vendetta. I'm just shocked, Mia said, her voice quieter now. I don't understand. Why did she do this? The senior flight attendant looked around, as though making sure no one was listening too closely. Unfortunately, Ms. Simmons, this seems to be part of a larger issue. Karen has been involved in some internal company matters, and her actions toward you are part of a deeper investigation. It's a situation we're still working to understand, but what we know is this. You were unfairly treated, and it was all due to personal reasons, not any fault of yours. Mia's heart sank again. There was so much more to this than she had thought. She had been caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. Something that wasn't about her at all, but about Karen's choices and the problems she had been carrying with her. As the senior flight attendant finished speaking, the cabin seemed to exhale all at once. The tension had been so thick that it was almost unbearable. Now, as the truth came to light, passengers started talking again, but the mood was completely different. The murmurs weren't of confusion anymore. They were of disbelief. Some were talking about how they couldn't believe Karen had done this. Others were voicing their shock at how a simple seating issue had turned into something so much bigger. Mia didn't know how to feel. She was still shaken by everything that had happened, but at least now, she had answers. She knew that she hadn't been wrong to feel uncomfortable about the situation. She wasn't crazy or overreacting. It wasn't her fault. As the plane began its descent toward the runway, Mia sat quietly in her seat, staring out of the window. The sky outside was painted with shades of orange and pink as the setting sun made its final descent. The peacefulness of the moment didn't match the storm of emotions Mia felt inside. Her heart was still racing, but it was no longer out of fear or confusion. Now, it was because of something different, something much deeper. She had made it through the worst part. The truth had come out. She had been wronged, and now the weight of the injustice she had faced was finally starting to lift. She hadn't backed down when Karen had tried to intimidate her. She hadn't let the harsh words and the dismissive actions of the flight attendant shake her. Mia had stood her ground, and now it was all coming to an end. The senior flight attendant had taken the lead, and Mia had trusted her to do the right thing. The senior attendant had made sure the truth came to light, and now Mia was about to witness the consequences of Karen's actions. As the plane descended closer to the airport, Mia couldn't help but think about what had happened. Everything had unfolded so quickly. One moment, Karen had been standing there, smirking, and the next, she had been exposed for her dishonesty. It was almost unbelievable to think that something as simple as a seat could have turned into such a big deal. But Mia knew it wasn't about the seat. It wasn't about the flight at all. This was about respect. It was about the fact that Mia had been treated unfairly because of who she was. Her mind went back to the moment when she had first been denied the seat. She had been confused, frustrated, and hurt. But now, as she sat there, she realized how strong she had been in that moment. She hadn't given in. She had remained calm and had stayed composed even when it would have been so easy to get angry. Mia was proud of herself for how she had handled it, and she knew that her actions had made a difference. As the plane began to touch down, a few more passengers shifted nervously in their seats, but Mia sat still, her body relaxed. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, as if everything was going to be okay. No matter what had happened, Mia had stood up for herself, and the truth had come out. That was what mattered. The plane finally landed with a soft thud, and the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers began to gather their things and prepare to leave. Mia remained seated for a moment longer. She wanted to take it all in. The ordeal was almost over. Then, as the plane slowly came to a stop at the gate, Mia saw security personnel step onto the plane. Two tall men in dark suits walked down the aisle toward the front of the plane. Mia recognized them immediately as the security team that worked for the airline. She had seen them around the airport before. As they walked past, Mia caught a glimpse of Karen. The flight attendant was still standing in the front of the plane, but she didn't look the same as she had before. She looked smaller, less confident, as if the weight of what had happened was finally sinking in. Her face was red with humiliation. She was no longer the proud, assertive woman who had tried to deny Mia her seat. Now, she looked defeated. The senior flight attendant had explained everything to her, and Karen's guilt was written all over her face. Mia didn't need to hear anything else. She already knew what was happening. Karen was being escorted off the plane. She was no longer part of the airline. Mia felt a sense of satisfaction. This was the justice she had been waiting for. Karen had tried to ruin her experience, but in the end, she had been the one to pay the price. The security officers didn't say anything to Mia, but they did stop for a moment as they passed her seat. They nodded politely, acknowledging her quietly. Mia returned the gesture, offering a small smile. She wasn't interested in a confrontation. She had gotten what she needed. The truth had come to light, and now, Karen was going to face the consequences of her actions. As the passengers began to disembark, Mia stood up, gathering her things and preparing to leave. But before she could take a step toward the door, she noticed something. The other passengers, the same ones who had once stared at her with curiosity, were now looking at her with something different. It wasn't just polite nods or quick glances. There was respect in their eyes. They recognized what she had done, and they knew that she had exposed something important. Mia's quiet strength had changed the dynamic on the plane. One by one, the passengers made their way toward the door. Some gave her a subtle smile, others gave her a small nod, but every single one of them acknowledged her in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about not letting anyone take advantage of you. Mia had proven that, and the passengers who had watched everything unfold now understood the power of that lesson. Mia made her way off the plane with Jason in tow, still holding his toy. He didn't understand the significance of what had happened, but Mia was okay with that. All she needed was for him to be safe, happy, and by her side. She had done everything she could to make sure that he would always be proud of her, no matter what. When Mia stepped into the terminal, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She was finally free of the tension that had weighed on her throughout the flight. She had faced the conflict, and she had emerged stronger than ever. The hardest part was over, and now all she had to do was reunite with her family. She had accomplished what she had set out to do. She had made sure that the truth had been heard, and the people who had wronged her had faced the consequences. As Mia walked through the airport, she noticed the change in the atmosphere. People who had been talking and laughing before were now quieter, more subdued. It was as if the entire airport had been affected by what had happened. Mia wasn't sure if anyone knew the full story, but she didn't care. All that mattered was that justice had been served. Karen had been caught in her lie, and Mia had stood up for herself in a way that would make anyone proud. When Mia finally reached the exit, she spotted her family waiting for her. Her sister, her parents, and a few other relatives were all standing there with smiles on their faces. They had been waiting for this moment, just as Mia had. She walked over to them, her heart full, and Jason ran ahead, excited to see his cousins. Mia smiled as she embraced her family. They had no idea what had happened during the flight, but Mia was glad for that. This moment was about family, about being together again after such a long time. It was about love and support, the things that really mattered. But even as Mia hugged her family, she couldn't help but think about what had happened. She had been tested, and she had passed. She had faced adversity with dignity and had emerged victorious. Mia had stood her ground, not for herself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or dismissed. As she stood there, surrounded by her family, Mia realized that the story wasn't just about a woman standing up for herself on an airplane. It was about something much bigger. It was about never allowing anyone to take away your dignity. It was about the strength to stand up, even when you're unsure of what will happen next. It was about holding on to your self-respect, no matter what. And in that moment, Mia knew that her actions had sent a message. She had shown the world that justice could be served, even in the most unlikely of places. Mia sat quietly on the bench, waiting for her family to gather around her. The day had been long, full of tension, surprises, and emotions, but now that it was all over, she felt a calmness she hadn't felt in a long time. The flight was behind her, Karen's lies had been exposed, and she had stood up for herself and what was right. But as she looked around at the people coming and going, she couldn't help but think about something more important, the lesson her experience had taught her, and the message she hoped others would take away from it. You see, Mia hadn't just won that battle on the plane. She had learned something much deeper about herself. It wasn't just about sitting in her seat and getting what she was owed. It was about knowing her worth and standing up for it, even when the world seemed against her. In that moment of reflection, Mia realized that sometimes standing your ground doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet strength, the kind that doesn't yell, the kind that doesn't fight, that speaks the loudest. The whole plane had been watching when the truth came to light. Mia didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout or throw a fit. All she did was remain calm, ask questions, and trust that the truth would reveal itself in the end. And that's what had happened. Mia didn't need to cause a scene to make things right. She just needed to stay true to herself. Mia thought about how people often try to judge others based on the way they look or the color of their skin. There are so many people who face challenges simply because of who they are. In the case of Mia, Karen had seen her as just another mother and had tried to make her feel small. But what Karen didn't know was that Mia was strong. She wasn't someone to be dismissed or overlooked. She had a quiet strength that couldn't be ignored. And even though Karen had tried to make her feel invisible, Mia proved that no one could take away her power. It made Mia wonder, How often do people judge others before they truly know them? How many times do people assume things about someone based on the color of their skin, the way they speak, or the clothes they wear? Too often, people are judged by what's on the outside and not by what's on the inside, their heart, their values, or their strength. But Mia's experience showed that what's on the inside always shines through. When Karen tried to deny her seat, she was thinking about the surface, about who Mia was and what she looked like. But Mia's strength came from within. It wasn't something Karen could see. Mia's strength wasn't about being loud or trying to prove a point. It was about holding her head high, standing her ground, and never letting anyone take away her dignity. And when the truth came out, when Karen's actions were exposed, it wasn't because Mia had done anything to hurt her. It was because Mia had simply stayed true to herself. She didn't let the unfairness of the situation break her. Instead, she showed everyone around her that no matter what they saw on the outside, her inner strength was much more powerful. In those final moments of the flight, as the passengers began to leave, Mia couldn't help but notice how things had changed. The whispers, the looks, the stares, none of that mattered anymore. She had stood her ground, and she had done it with dignity. And now, even the other passengers seemed to understand that. It wasn't about a seat on an airplane. It was about much more than that. It was about self-respect, standing up for what's right, and showing others that no one can take away your worth. Mia smiled to herself as she walked out of the airport and into the waiting arms of her family. Her heart was full. It wasn't just because she had been vindicated or because the truth had come to light. It was because she knew that she had grown stronger. She knew that she could face anything that came her way, no matter how difficult or unfair it seemed. And most importantly, she knew that the strength within her was more powerful than anything on the outside. It wasn't about being louder than the voices of others. It wasn't about getting revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about standing firm in who you are, no matter what anyone else thinks. It was about knowing your worth and never letting anyone make you feel small. So the next time someone tries to judge you or put you down, remember Mia's story. Remember that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. The ones who judge by appearances or the color of your skin. They never see the strength that lies underneath. And that strength? It's something they'll never be able to take away. Mia had learned that, and so can you. The truth will always come out in the end. And no matter how hard people try to bring you down, your strength will always rise above it. So the next time you face a challenge, stand tall, stand put, and know that the quiet strength inside you is more than enough to get you through. And that perhaps is the most important lesson of all. Keep your head high, keep your heart strong, and never let anyone make you feel small. You have the strength inside you to handle anything that comes your way. Because sometimes just standing your ground in silence speaks louder than any words ever could.